Our first reading this morning is from Acts, the 16th chapter. During the night, Paul had a vision. There stood a man of Macedonia, pleading with him and saying, "Come over to Macedonia and help us." When he had seen the vision, he immediately tried to cross over to Macedonia, being convinced that God had called us to proclaim good news to them. We set sail from Troas and took a straight course to Samothrace, the following day to Neapolis, and from there to Philippi, which is a leading city of the district of Macedonia and a Roman colony. We remained in this city for some days. On the Sabbath day, we went outside the gate by the river, where we supposed there was a place of prayer. And we sat down and spoke to the women who had gathered there. A certain woman named Lydia, a worshiper of God, was listening to us. She was from the city of Thyatira and a dealer in purple cloth. The Lord opened her heart to listen eagerly to what was said by Paul. When she and her household were baptized, she urged us, saying, "If you have judged me to be faithful to the Lord, come and stay at my home." And she prevailed upon us. The word of the Lord.
So it occurred to me this week that when I preach, I hardly ever examine the Apostle Paul or his intentions. And I guess if I'm honest, it's because I've never really felt like Paul's story is for me, for a few reasons. The first is because Paul is often touted as doubter turned believer, persecutor turned champion, villain turned hero, which is just not my story. I'm certainly glad for his story, and I also marvel at the stories of those who have had miraculous conversions. But those also aren't my stories. Second, most of the stories we have of Paul seem to depict him as a devout, dedicated, focused person of faith, which is also not my story. I'd like to be able to liken myself to Paul in the same way I'd like to be able to liken myself to Wonder Woman. However, I don't have a superhero kind of faith or extraordinary tenacity. I mean, all it takes is for the alternator to go bad in the car, the toddler to have a 20-minute meltdown, there to be no chocolate within reach, and the air conditioner fan to go out in the span of 24 hours for me to lose faith. And yes, all of those things happened this past week. Additionally, Paul is a prolific writer with an insatiable desire to preach. He's probably written more words in his letters to various churches than I have in my vocabulary. He makes the introvert in me scream. So Paul's story just doesn't really feel like my story. However, I will say that today's story that we have of Paul helped me view him in a new way, and thereby myself, faith, and the church. I think that many of us are familiar with the fact that Paul was an accomplished missionary, and he traveled extensively throughout Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. And that's the basic premise for today. Paul set sail to Macedonia at the prompting of a vision. Let me just stop there for a second. At the prompting of a vision, this uptight, somewhat arrogant Jesus freak just up and takes off for Europe. There's a word that's used for people who exhibit this type of behavior. It's called Wanderlust. And Wanderlust isn't a characteristic I usually associate with the Apostle Paul. Probably because while Wanderlust is defined as a strong desire or yearning to travel, it also carries a connotation of carefree, adventuresome, and wild, all of which seem like unlikely characteristics of Paul, religion, and the church. However, these are things I can relate to. And as I thought about it, I realized that many of the apostles were wanderers, and so was Jesus. The Bible even mentions that at times Jesus did not have a place to rest his head and relied upon the kindness of others to give him shelter. Jesus wandered also. And so I started thinking that maybe we could use some more wanderlust in the church, in our faith, and in our lives. Now, don't get me wrong, I like a well thought out plan. I like to have clear direction. I like a defined purpose. Frankly, the idea of just taking off into the great beyond with a rudderless boat seems irresponsible and frightening. However, I've also done enough wandering, soul-searching, exploring, and getting lost in my life to know how it feels to be in the wild. It feels alive. I feel alive, and God feels alive. So while it's true that Paul wanders into Lydia's life and changes her life and the lives of those he meets, I believe it also enlivens Paul's life and gives meaning to his life. The life of Paul reminds us that Jesus calls us beyond our carefully made plans and our safe assumptions, and into something daring and unpredictable and possibly unprecedented. Perhaps God places wanderlust in our souls as a means of whetting our appetites for more, as a way of keeping us unsatisfied. And I think that usually we think of being unsatisfied as a bad thing. I mean, we haven't had enough to eat, we're unsatisfied. Our haircut didn't go as planned, unsatisfied. Our job isn't living up to our expectations, unsatisfied. Or we feel disconnected from family and friends, we're unsatisfied. The lawn job we hired out looks like it was done by a herd of goats, unsatisfied. However, dissatisfaction, when redeemed by God, can create a type of emotional restlessness which can compel us to seek connection and take some risks. I think that dissatisfaction is an element of wanderlust that's essential because it cultivates curiosity and hope. Now, before I go on, I actually want to unpack a little bit of what I just said because it's important. At least I think it's important. That phrase, redeemed by God, in relation to wanderlust. Sometimes when we think of wanderlust or reasons why we wander, it's because we're lusting for a way out of pain, a way out of monotony, a way out of today. And that feeling of wanting a way out can heighten our feelings of desperation and dissatisfaction. Lust of anything in and of itself doesn't lead to fruitful connection. However, when God redeems our wandering, and redeemed is just a fancy way of saying uses our stuff for God's purposes or for good, we start to realize that what we really want is a way in. Isn't that true? Don't we want in? Isn't that what our restlessness and our dissatisfaction yearn for? Now, the good news of Jesus is that we are already in. And by that, I mean Jesus already loves us. We are already found. We already matter. And when we begin to trust that we truly do belong to God, that we truly are God's children, we can wander with meaningful meandering towards the fullness that God desires for our lives and for God's church. When I think of all the places that I have loved, places I have rode or run or hiked and wandered through, I believe that I have loved them, that they have mattered to me, that they have changed me and connected to me, because in some way they faintly resemble the new heaven and new earth that God is creating. And so I sort of feel like it's more accurate to say wander love rather than wander lust. And in that vein, I wonder what would happen if we followed Paul's lead and listened to the restlessness in our hearts and set sail. I mean, what would that look like in your personal life? And what would it look like in the church? What sorts of surprises might be waiting for us? Who might we meet? Now, in some ways, there's no way to know the answers to these questions. There's no way to know what makes one thing happen and not another, what leads to what causes something to flourish and something to die, why some relationships click and some don't. There is just no way to know for sure. The only thing that is for sure is if we never wander, we will be just where we are, which can be okay sometimes. But it can also be an indicator for stuck. Now, I'm not saying we should just make a bunch of rash decisions, but I do wonder what it would look like if we thought about how Wanderlust looks in our lives and in our church. If part of the conversation might involve these words. Hey, guess what I dreamed about last night? And then when someone says that to you, you could say, I don't know, but I'm really excited to hear. Now, I'm not exactly sure about how to cultivate this Wanderlust, but I do think it has something to do with trusting what we know to be true. Trusting that there is no place that we can go where God is not. Believing there is more in store for each of us and for this place. Recognizing that there is something sacred in each person who crosses our path, and being curious about what that sacredness might be. And not quieting the restlessness that makes us wonder, what if? Now, I don't think embracing this idea of Wanderlust means things will always be pretty, like a breathtaking view from a high-top cliff. Nor will always be comfortable. Sometimes it'll hurt. Sometimes it'll break our hearts. I think most of us know that already. But that's okay. Because I think that if we could ask Paul, he would say that the journey changes us. And it should change us. It leaves marks on our memories, on our consciousness, on our hearts. It also impacts our faith. But hopefully, in the wandering and the wondering and the dreaming, we would leave something good behind, something that mattered. And so the question is today, all of this leads up to, what do you dream about for the church, and what do you dream about for yourself? Pay attention to those dreams, those visions. Because this much I do know, Paul was open to seeing the vision of God offered to him. And it changed the world. Now maybe we won't change the world. Maybe that's not our job. But maybe, by the grace of God, we will help usher in that new heaven and new earth that Jesus was so passionate about.